Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. I'm really excited to provide some updates and insight onto the exciting world of security audits for open source projects. We're going to talk about some of our experience and some of the things that we've seen coming out of doing this for quite a number of years now. I want to just thank, again, all of you for being here today, all the other fantastic speakers, and everyone that made this possible. I could probably spend the rest of this time just thanking people, so we'll just group it into everybody and just say thank you to everyone. So if there's one key point that I'd like to make, it's that security audits do in fact work. They tend to be very effective, and a lot of that comes from this excellent research done on the lifetimes of zero-day vulnerabilities, which one of the key findings was that finding vulnerabilities often requires more in-depth auditing, logic review, and source code analysis in order to go several layers deep. And interestingly enough, what is listed right before this point is that this especially applies to projects that have been long established, been around for some time, typically have a lot of eyeballs reviewing kind of those surface level issues that you tend to see, but very much going deeper and looking for problems via in-depth auditing, manual code review, tends to correlate with finding vulnerabilities that can be quite harmful to a project. So going along with that, my kind of observational thesis is that security audits, when done to a high level of quality, are an incredibly valuable tool in the tool belt for securing the open source ecosystem. Our body of work spanning 9 years, close to 100 security audits now, and actually over 200 medium or high severity vulnerabilities found and fixed, some of them very nasty, does support this observational thesis. There is a link to our body of work, which is our GitHub repository, where you can see all of the up-to-date audit reports that we publish, as well as the blog, which also provides that up-to-date updates on what we're doing. So while preparing for this talk, I tried doing a lot of research. I tried to find all the research out there in the specific space of auditing open source projects, doing security audits of open source projects. And maybe to some folks' surprise, maybe not, there was really not a lot out there. This is a very, I would say, emerging field, and there isn't a lot of research done on this specific topic. So that being said, late in the middle of last year, when we published our 50th audit milestone, we took the opportunity to really analyze all of the results from that body of work to try and generate some research, some insight that can be used as a source for the community as this grows. And so we were very excited to be essentially at the cutting edge of the research in this field. From that analysis, we came up with a couple of key data points, one being the top 3 types of vulnerabilities that were found and fixed throughout those 50 audits. We have some top 5 lessons learned. These are lessons that were mostly learned the hard way, but that's the beauty of lessons learned, so that we're always iterating and improving and trying to increase our effectiveness and impact on open source projects and communities. So we'll share some of those. And kind of in that same vein, some common auditing mistakes and how to avoid them. We're excited about this insight as well, because as we are seeing more communities pursue security audits, a lot of them don't know where to start. So we're hoping that even if a data point, and maybe not the absolute best data point, it is some insight based off of very real experience spanning back 9 years. And then lastly, some bonus, in aggregating this data, we're able to come up with some interesting statistics and numbers to share with you all today. Speaking of research, one of the good resources out there is the Threats, Risks, and Mitigations in the Open Source Ecosystem white paper. This is under OpenSSF now, but the version 1 did have some very, I would say, nascent or preliminary information on security audits, essentially saying that with over 2 million, and as we saw from Catherine and Ryan's presentation, seemingly a lot more than 2 million open source software packages. But with all the open source software packages out there, very, very few of them have been looked at from a security perspective. And in that same vein of kind of being at the cutting edge of the research, we were able to provide some insight into version 1.2, which has an updated section essentially going over what I'm going to go talk about right now, which is that we have found security audits to consistently demonstrate measurable and sustainable improvements to open source projects as a result of security audits. So jumping right into it, these were the top 3 types of vulnerabilities that were found and fixed through those first 50 audits. The first one was denial of service, tying to the CWE, the Common Weakness Enumeration of CWE 400. This probably is not terribly surprising, as this is still one of the most common problems in software. Next, we had cross-site scripting and OS command injection, a number of CWEs there that are listed, as well as authorization with those common weakness enumerations there. And the ones that are starred are actually mapped to the most recent OWASP top 10, which I think highlights the consistency of these issues being in the open source ecosystem, and you know, from another research resource. Next, we have a couple of lessons learned. The first one being the importance of clarity and communication. This should come as no surprise, as any engagement that requires multiple stakeholders, multiple interests, different groups of different sizes and capabilities. One of the most consistent things that can really help is the importance of clarity and communication. This can apply specifically at the beginning of an engagement where expectations, deliverables, essentially as much as we can going over what is to be expected from an engagement so that everyone is on the same page. And number 2 is that success correlates with scoping. This point, as well as a couple other ones, reminded me of something from Seth Larson's talk earlier about how there really are no kind of silver bullet solutions in security, and that is something we've very much seen and found that when we customize all of our work that is to be done in a security audit, it has to be customized to the needs of the project instead of applying maybe a generic template or something that you can say definitively, we're going to do this to every single project. We found that not to be the case. The more that these are customized to the needs of the project, typically the more successful that they are. Number 3, which kind of is related to lesson learned 1, is interest and collaboration. As I mentioned, these are very complex. These engagements tend to be quite complex with a number of different groups and parties. You can see we've had instances of maintainers or communities being really spread all over the world, different time zones. So really garnering that interest, especially at the beginning of the engagement, we found to be a really important lesson learned. And this also comes from, as I mentioned, some lessons being learned the hard way, where for any number of reasons that may exist, where not having that really did affect the outcome, especially when it came to when we talk about number 5, which is resolution and what happens after the audit. But to continue on, number 4, we have balance of testing types. So there have been a lot of advances in augmenting the manual nature of the work needed for security audits with static and dynamic testing, analysis, fuzzing, CI/CD implementations. And while I think a absolutely critical piece of doing this work successfully is that manual aspect from an expert, that can really be augmented with different testing types. And this is something that we've seen a lot of, which will be evident in some of the statistics that are coming up in a minute. And then lastly, yes, resolution is pivotal. This kind of relates to a lot of the other lessons learned, but working together on resolving the issues, on working with the community to implement improvements and fixes is one of the best ways to make the value that we're providing in these security audits more tangible and more essentially evidenced by fixes, pull requests, things of that nature. Okay, I'm doing all right on time. And then going along with the lessons learned, these are some things that we have seen both in our experience as well as part of what we try to do is have essentially a ecosystem-wide conversation. So we try to talk as much as we can with different software foundations, with different foundations, different groups that fund open source initiatives. In our conversations with folks, with organizations like Google and Amazon Web Services. So we're able to have a lot of good conversations, and not only are we able to identify some common auditing mistakes, both from our experience and learning all of those lessons over those years, but as well as observing it in the space and hearing the pain points of other foundations, for example, that were pursuing security auditing for some of their projects, many of which did eventually become partners with OSTIF because we essentially were able to handle those things for them. But the first one that we've came up with is focusing on the bid and not the bidder. So especially with budgets tightening, there's many different factors as to the funding that actually can be allocated for a project. And lots of times, more focus is placed on the bid, so who bid the least amount, who's going to cost the least, and maybe not so much factoring in who the bidder is. So if it's a team that is extremely well-versed in the project, for example, they will add a lot of benefits to an engagement that's above just what the dollar amount of the cost is. So that is, I would say, a common an auditing mistake. And to avoid that, it would be exactly what I mentioned, really focusing on the quality of the bid, the work being proposed, the previous work or experience of the bidder or bidding teams, and what their documentation quality looks like, for example. So these are all things that might not be directly tied to the dollar amount of a bid for some security work, but make a big difference. Wonderful, thank you. Second one, lack of communication. So in certain situations, no news is good news does apply. But in other situations, no news means nothing's happening, and you guys, nothing is happening if we don't know about, if we're not hearing about it. So in addition to lack of communication, I think it's also understanding what communication methods and styles work better for the parties that you're working with. But of course, at least in our experience, more communication is typically better, just so the different parties that are involved know what the latest news is, and we all know where everyone is at with each other. The third one, which kind of goes back to the lesson learned of balance of testing types, would be only using automated tooling. We found that manual review, that human aspect, is incredibly important to finding some of the, for example, the logic bugs that we've seen, and some of the more the real deep analysis that was required, and that came from expert human touch, not so much from a automated tool or some kind of tool. Kind of going back to the silver bullet ideology. I personally, I just don't think we will ever see what we would consider a silver bullet that would solve a lot of these security issues. I think we just have to go out and do the work and review the projects. And then just to reiterate the importance of scoping, proper scoping is really, really pivotal. We've seen some engagements that we've heard from other folks in the space where if the scope is just so incredibly wide, where you're putting a lot more, I guess, trust, and not necessarily trust, but when the scope is almost not defined, it's so wide it's almost not defined, then I'd say there's a much higher chance of a toss-up for outcomes, whereas when a scope is really well defined and everyone who is at the table knows exactly what the scope is and what the intended outcomes are, we've seen those tend to correlate with much better engagements. So for my last couple minutes, I mentioned there are some statistics that we were able to aggregate. So as I mentioned, middle of last year, we published our 50th audit milestone, and by the time we actually had published that, we were closer to 80. And when you count our projects in progress or in the pipeline, we're at just about 100. So we're really proud of the growth that we've seen, and it gives us the opportunity to gain more experience in this space. As mentioned a little earlier, we're at 257 for high or medium severity findings fixed. Out of the CWEs, and this applies specifically to the data from the first 50. We saw 26 different types of CWEs fixed for projects. So it's not so much, we're just fixing one type of issue. It just goes to show the varying needs of projects. And lastly, going along with automated tooling and things that help projects over the long term, by my count, we were at around 214 fuzzers built for continually monitoring projects. So these are things that help the project moving forward after the audit is done. A couple of numbers. So we had the approximate cost per engagement of around $74,000 US, and the approximate cost per bug fix, this would be for medium or high, or tool implementation, came out to about, thank you, just under $6,600. And almost every security audit has a threat model, either developed or augmented, static and dynamic analysis tool integration, fuzzing integration, as well as some mix of vulnerabilities found and fixed, typically. So I'd like to go back to this graphic here about the importance and efficacy of security audits, and why they're so important is because you need to do more in-depth auditing and go deep in projects to find those real big issues and help projects alleviate those vulnerabilities. And quickly before I conclude, some folks have asked, kind of about how OSTIF works or is different and kind of how we're able to maintain higher efficacy of our security audits. And it kind of comes down to three main things. So the first, which I think is very important, is having a champion or an independent organization at the base there really carry this engagement through from start to finish. Because as was mentioned earlier, a lot of organizations, foundations, they might not have their own internal resources to champion this process. Second, and this goes, I think, back to the scoping topic, which is that working with strong audit experts. So these are individuals and teams who are very highly specialized in the field that they are working on, specifically in open source security, tends to yield better outcomes. And lastly, project engagement and involvement. So we always get the maintainers and the community behind the projects engaged with these collaborations. So with that, I am right at time. Thanks so much for sticking around right before lunch, especially. But myself and Derek Zimmer here from OSTF will be around all week, so we'd love to talk anything you'd be interested in and how we can help. And again, thank you all so much again. Cheers.